And good day to the patrons of the Livingston Library. I'm Evan Weiner. It's been a while since I've been at your library, probably about a year. And hello to all my friends in Livingston. And thank you last year for treating me so nicely when I did the baseball talk at Livingston Library. I got some really nice notes. My name is Evan Weiner. I am a speaker, but my background is radio and TV. I started in this business in 1971. I was at Spring Valley High School in Rockland County, New York, 11th grade, and Joe Dionisio was my teacher. And he says, "You got a good voice. How would you like to be in radio?" And I said, "I want to be in radio the worst way." And I was. I was on a show called Tiger Talk, which was on WRKL Radio. And that was in Mount Ivy, New York. And we did a show every week, 15 minutes a week. It was a terrible show, but it opened the door, and I must thank Joe for the opportunity to put me on radio and also to open up the doors at newspapers with the Journal News of Nyack, New York as a sports stringer at Spring Valley High School, and the Bergen Record up in Hackensack, same thing. In fact, I did 3 different stints at the Bergen Record, high school, late 70s, and returning as an op-ed writer in the 2000s. About 6.5 years later, I was working for a radio station, WGRC Radio. Steve North was my news director. And he said, "You have to work on Saturdays." Fine, no problem. Rockland Community College was doing a speaker series, so I got to interview people like Ralph Nader, Julian Bond right off the bat. And it's a Saturday, late March and Saturday. Steve said, "You got to go cover the New York State Democratic fundraiser at the Tappan Zee Townhouse in Nyack. Don't worry about getting anything for Saturday. We want it for Monday morning." So I walk in there and I see a whole bunch of people, politicians. The first guy I see is an obscure assemblyman from New York City by the name of Jerome Nadler. Don't know whatever happened to him. Daniel Patrick Moynihan was there, along with Hugh Carey and Mario Cuomo and a whole bunch of others. But there was a tall guy, really good-looking guy, walked in, tall guy, good-looking, by the name of, well, I forget right now, but I did recognize him because I watched Batman. And it was Mayor Lindsay of Gotham City, of course, John Lindsay. And he comes up to me, never introduces himself, comes up to me, and I'm 21. I got big bushy hair in those days. And he says, "I like you." I said, "Oh, okay." He says, "I want to tell you something." I said, "Okay." "I'm running for Senate." And he's going to run for Senate. Threw his hat in the ring that day, stayed in New York. So I got a scoop. I'm 21 years old. I'm really excited. I'm 21, almost a year out of college, graduated early. And run back to my radio station, WGRC, file that, send it to the Associated Press, Marlene Egg, file it with her. Also file it with UPI, United Press International, Randy Berlage. And okay, it's done. And then all of a sudden I get a call from WNEW Radio in New York, Henry Marcotte. 1130 on your AM dial, and was a top flight news station back in those days, 1978, March of 78. And Henry Marcotte says to me, "We'd like to buy that from you." I said, "How much you paying me?" $10. Sold. And that's how I got on WNEW with William B. Williams and all those other people. And politically speaking, it also really started my career covering politics. Since then, I've been somehow involved covering politics. And presidential impact on sports, Jimmy Carter. I was around in 1980 when Jimmy Carter announced the Olympic boycott of the Moscow Soviet Union Games. So I've been around this game a little bit. But presidents do have an impact on society through what they talk about sports. And you see the White House back there. Presidential impact on society through sports. Actually, it's more than Teddy Roosevelt. It goes back to Andrew Johnson, and it's more than Barack Obama. It continues with Donald Trump. And here's Andrew Johnson. Andrew Johnson became president after Abraham Lincoln was assassinated in April of 1865. Civil War is ending and has ended. And Johnson is looking for something to unite the country, and it happened to be baseball. Baseball started growing 1850s. It was played during the Civil War. And Andrew Johnson and his advisors thought, hey, let's see if this works. Let's see if we could somehow find something that unites the shattered nation, the North and the South. And they come upon this thing. Why don't we invite baseball players from the Washington team to the White House? And why don't we do that? And it's going to be a big deal. And maybe, just maybe, all of the threads can be tightened again in the United States. And so on August 30th, 1865, Andrew Johnson brings in players from the Washington Nationals, another iteration of the Washington Nationals, and the Brooklyn Atlantics. And they are going to be honored at the White House. This is the first official meeting between a president and an organized baseball team at the Executive Mansion. And baseball in Washington in the 1860s would take on a more prominent role, not necessarily uniting the country after the Civil War, but they thought that baseball was on its way to become something of a national game. At that point, there was no national game in the United States. In fact, there were two warring parts of the United States trying to mend their differences. Following Andrew Johnson was Ulysses Grant. And U.S. Grant, he was interesting because he would leave the White House, and there was a baseball field behind the White House. And he would play baseball with the kids. Guess didn't have much else to do as the chief executive of the United States. Johnson liked baseball. He saw it was an opportunity after the Civil War to unite the country, national unity through baseball. Grant played baseball with the kids in the neighborhood. Now, Grover Cleveland, and there's the little museum of his birthplace nearby in Livingston. Grover Cleveland was not much of a baseball fan, but here he meets with Cap Anson, who was the captain of the Chicago baseball team in the 1880s. But he wasn't much of a baseball fan. In fact, he thought very little of going to a baseball game. He's not a fan. What do you imagine the American people would think of me if I wasted my time going to the ball game? Well, he never went to a baseball game, but other presidents would go to a baseball game eventually, like William Howard Taft. Theodore Roosevelt, Theodore Roosevelt, he has a lot to do with saving college football. Theodore Roosevelt, of course, was the president after William McKinley is assassinated in Buffalo. And he becomes president, and he's got some interesting relationships, say, with the president of Harvard. Theodore Roosevelt is credited with saving college football. Football, the way it is played today, has no resemblance to what it was played like in 1904 and 1905, when 22 and 18 players were killed on the football field. Roosevelt threatened to ban football in America unless rules were implemented to make the game safer. After those 40 players, and it was at least 40 players that died from injuries on the field over a 2-year period, 1904, 1905, many more of the players were maimed. Literally, flying wedges were going around. People would pick up players and just throw them for first downs and things of that nature. It was a rough game. Coal miners game from Western Pennsylvania, portions of Ohio. And Roosevelt says, okay, make the game safer. But why is Roosevelt so involved in what was going on? Besides, nobody could figure out how Roosevelt could end the game, because he couldn't. If people wanted to play, they were going to play. But the threat of a ban was enough to get changes in playing rules to make the game safer. The Roosevelt Initiative would eventually lead to the formation of the NCAA. Now, what happened was this. Roosevelt decides he is going to call the presidents of Harvard, Yale, and Princeton into the Oval Office and tell them to fix the game. Now there's more to that than meets the eye. See, Theodore Roosevelt hated the president of Harvard, Charles Eliot, and it was the Harvard contingent that wanted to ban the game or at least change the game, and they didn't like each other. Now, Walter Camp and the Yale contingent said, hey, there's no problem with the game. Let's keep it as is. Roosevelt also had a couple of other reasons why he wanted the game to continue. One of them, the Spanish-American War, 1898. The other, his son, was playing football. And Roosevelt was an outdoorsman, a rough and ready type guy who thought that being vigorous in the outdoors led to good health. Cartoons like that in the newspaper were common in those days. There were 11 people on the football team. The 12th man, 11 on 11, 11 offensive players, 11 defensive players. The 12th man. And that's a cartoon in the newspaper. And it's skull and crossbones and the guy snapping a football. If you notice, the football is bigger than the football that there is today. It was kind of watermelon size back in those days, and they reduced the size of the football. But because there were so many deaths and so many maimings back in 1904, 1905, you would see cartoons like this in the newspaper. The 12th man, the 12th player in every football game, death. I demand that football change its rules or be abolished, change the game or forsake it. His son played football, Theodore Roosevelt, and suffered major injuries both in high school and college. But the kid played football, and Roosevelt thought it wasn't a bad endeavor. There was also something else that was going on. I said the War of 1898, the Spanish-American War, where he goes up the hill, San Juan Hill in Puerto Rico. He has a soft spot for the game because 10 of the Rough Riders that went up San Juan Hill in Puerto Rico and fought with him during the Spanish-American War listed their occupations as professional football players when they enlisted in 1898. So Roosevelt wanted to keep the game going for a number of reasons. The Rough Riders, his son, and he hated Charles Eliot, just hated Charles Eliot over in Harvard. So those were the three reasons he wanted to keep them going, the game going. And so they meet in the White House in the Oval Office, the college presidents, and back in those days, they had the sway. There was some sort of professional football played in Western Pennsylvania, but that really didn't matter, by the coal miners. It was the college game that was important in those days, and they would come up with a whole bunch of rules. The American Football Rules Committee was formed, and in 1906, they changed the game. Plays were designed to open up the game to make it less dangerous to play, including forward pass. First down, you had to go 10 yards instead of 5 yards for a first down to keep things going. Bad formations, they were all eliminated. Now, that allegedly made the game safer. 115 years later, we're not talking about the game being safer. We're talking about a concussion issue. Players with concussion leading to brain injuries, leading to other things, which Barack Obama would tackle in 2014. Theodore Roosevelt saved football in terms of the way it was played in those days. And of course, football, college football would grow. National Football League would be founded in 1920, and football would explode on the national landscape in the 1960s, thanks to two presidents. We'll talk about that in a few minutes. So college football would survive. The committee passed legislation that led to the introduction of the forward pass. Prior to that, you could throw the ball backwards, but you couldn't throw the ball forwards. First down and 10. More importantly, all mass formations gone, gang tackling gone. Supposed to make the game safer. Probably didn't, but college football survived and pro football survived. That's William Howard Taft. William Howard Taft was president after Roosevelt. He lasted one term. He was elected in 1908, so 1909 to 1913. And there was a question about women and their right to vote. And they wanted the right to vote. Taft didn't want to give them the right to vote. So one day, Taft entertains them in the Oval Office, April 1910, morning meeting. And they are there and they are yelling and screaming. They want the vote. They want the vote. These people were the precursors of Alice Paul, the Alice Paul Museum in New Jersey, who literally was ready to starve herself to death in 1917 for the right to vote. So these women basically believed in the cause, and because they were such believers in the cause, they went out there and protested, and they ended up in the Oval Office one day in April of 1910, April 14th, 1910, to be precise. Things are not going well during this meeting between Taft and a number of the women suffragettes. So he decides, you know, I got to get out of here. How do I get out of here? How do I get out of here? How do I get out of here? Oh, I know how. It's a baseball game today. Let's go see the baseball game. He's having a bad day at the office, really bad day at the office, and the women are just banging on him. Hey, we want to vote. We want to vote. Why aren't we voting? How come we're not voting? We want to vote. We believe that we should have the vote. And it's going on and on and on. So he gets one of his aides, says, hey, get us out to the baseball game. Take me out to the baseball game, which was a song that started, of course, in 1908, but had nothing to do with William Howard Taft. Although it might have been a woman's liberation song, if you think of it, because it's a woman who wants to go to a baseball game, and women didn't go to baseball games in those days. Her boyfriend didn't want to go to the baseball game. She said, take me out to the ball game. Anyway, he wants to go to the game because he wants to lift not only his spirits, but the staff's spirits. April 14th, 1910. So he does go to the game, and they find out, some of the manager of the Washington team and some of the other people, that the president is coming. And so they hastily decide, hey, he's here. Why doesn't he throw out the first pitch? It's the first game of the baseball season. And he does. And there he is. They hastily get to the bunting and put him in this little area. You do notice there are some women who are there at the baseball game, and they give him the ball and he throws it out. Now, William Howard Taft was a big man. He was probably the heaviest man ever he was the heaviest man ever to be the president of the United States. He once got stuck in a bathtub, and they decided that he needed a new bathtub after he got stuck in there, and they got him out of there. So he was a big man, and you got to remember, back in those days at baseball games or other venues, that pretty much the seats were 19 inches across, like at Fenway Park today, not 23 inches. He's a big man, and he's squirming, and he's moving around, and he's trying to get comfortable. And in the middle of the seventh inning, he decides to get up. Everybody else gets up, sign of respect for the President of the United States, and they all get up because they think he's leaving. But he's not leaving. He's just doing the seventh inning stretch. Now, there may have been instances where the seventh inning stretch took place, particularly back in Ohio, where Taft came from, or other places. A lot of people have taken credit for being the father, it was a man, the father of the seventh inning stretch. But Taft did it at a Major League Baseball game. He was the president, and we have two traditions, thanks probably to the woman suffragettes. President throwing out the first pitch of the game, mostly in Washington, D.C., and the seventh inning stretch. Meanwhile, the women would not get the right to vote under Taft. They would eventually get the right to vote under Woodrow Wilson. But Taft, getting upset, had to go to a baseball game, started two baseball traditions. Seventh inning stretch, and that's the legend, that he was cramped between, he felt cramped, and he decided to get up. He didn't leave the game. People stood up and sat down. When he left, they stood up again, and they left. Woodrow Wilson and World War I. This is kind of a tricky one in the sense that Wilson really didn't do anything much for baseball, which was the only sport that was played at that point. He really didn't do it, but he used baseball for his pitch for patriotism, because Uncle Sam was going to war, baseball should be going to war as well. Baseball was considered a non-essential job. The Army General, Enoch Crowder, convinced Newton Baker, who was the United States Secretary of War at the time, that any draft-eligible men, and all baseball players between the ages of 18 and 34 in those days, that any draft-eligible men employed in non-essential jobs should be forced to choose: enlist to help stateside or risk going to the front lines of Europe. Hank Gowdy, who was a catcher with the Boston Braves, with their World Series team in 1914, was the first baseball player to enlist in World War I. Others also went. Christy Mathewson, who's the great New York Giants pitcher, who got hit with mustard plaster and basically ruined his lungs, went as well. A whole bunch of other people. The 1918 season was shortened because of the war. The World Series was played in September. Many players enlisted in the war effort. As I said, Gowdy was the first to enlist. The American League didn't want to play a World Series. The National League owners did. It's a good thing for the Boston Red Sox in the American League with Babe Ruth, because the American League team, Boston, won the World Series, beating the Chicago Cubs. And Babe Ruth had a pretty good series, not with the bat, but as a pitcher. 1918 World Series also brought us something else. Get into the game. There is Uncle Sam, baseball bat in hand. And Uncle Sam and baseball was used as part of a propaganda project by Woodrow Wilson. The Committee on Public Information was created by Wilson. And the national anthem shows up at the World Series in 1918. And it would be played each day of the series, except it wasn't the national anthem at that point. It wouldn't be the national anthem until 1931. It was the Star-Spangled Banner, and it had some history in baseball. As early as 1897, it was played during opening day ceremonies in Philadelphia, and more regularly at the Polo Grounds in Upper Manhattan, New York City, in 1898. Now, this was a song that was played at the end of the day during flag lowering, and it was played on military bases, Army base, Navy base, no Air Force back in those days. But all of a sudden, it ends up at the World Series. Game 1, remember, there's a big push for patriotism, a really big push for patriotism. America is at war, going to war in 1917. The war would not end. This is September of 1918, so it would still be 2 months before the war ended. Military band happened to be on hand at Fenway Park for Game 1 of the 1918 World Series. William Howard Taft invented the 7th inning stretch, so there's a 7th inning stretch, and that band all of a sudden starts playing the song, The Star-Spangled Banner. It begins the regular playing of the song at sports events, basically at baseball games. Wasn't really too much. In fact, basketball had just been invented. Hockey was a Canadian game, and it was college football. There was really very little pro football at the time. So baseball, which was the national pastime, the song appears, it's played every day, and the song plays through and through and through. In 1931, it would become the national anthem, partly due to baseball, partly due to Woodrow Wilson. Now, Herbert Hoover didn't do very much for sports. We have skipped over Warren G. Harding and Calvin Coolidge. The only Coolidge story I have was told to me by Art Modell, the Cleveland Browns owner back in the 1980s and 90s. It was talking about Calvin Coolidge, and that George Halas and the Chicago Bears football players were supposed to show up at the White House. And they do. And they're brought in, and Halas told the story to Modell, who told the story to me. And Calvin Coolidge looks up, and he's told, Mr. President, here's George Halas and the Chicago Bears. And Coolidge looked up, where are the Bears? Guess he expected dancing bears. Herbert Hoover, here's seen throwing a baseball, the Depression. And Herbert Hoover leads the country at the beginning of the Depression, which starts in October of 1929. couple things happen here. Babe Ruth is looking for a new contract. There's the Babe toward the tail end of his career. The Babe is looking for a new contract in 1932, and he wants $80,000 a year, which is more than Hoover. And he has a news conference, and somebody from one of the New York papers, and there were about 13, 14 New York papers back then, looks at the Babe and says, Babe, you make $80,000 a year, you're making more than the president. And Babe responded, what the hell has Hoover got to do with this? Anyway, I had a better year than he did. And he probably did, even though Babe was, 36, 37, and out of shape at the time. Great baseball player. Best baseball player of all time. Can hit and can pitch. There was one thing that Herbert Hoover did do that almost injured or killed the entertainment industry. One of the things that Hoover tried to do to get America out of the Depression was a 1932 amusement tax, a levy that was designed to raise more money for the United States government in the fight against the Depression. And this would have impact on sports. It would hurt baseball's attendance, but all 16 baseball teams did survive. That was not the same thing with the National Football League. The National Football League was kind of a fly-by-night outfit back in those days. Put up your $100, $500, you got a team. They whittled down during the Depression. The National Hockey League would end up losing teams during the Depression. There was no National Basketball Association team. Movie attendance was harmed because of this amusement tax. It didn't work. Franklin Roosevelt, it was a nice September day in 2017 when my wife and I decided to go visit Franklin and Eleanor, who were perfect hosts. For the occasion, Franklin was well dressed. I wasn't. Eleanor was a gracious host. They told us to read books. Franklin and Eleanor are a little stiff, and you couldn't turn the pages on the books. But other than that, I had a couple things I wanted to talk to Roosevelt about. Three things in particular. One, the 1936 Olympics. Two, being at the World's Fair April 30th, 1939, and being on TV, opening the World's Fair, and baseball following Pearl Harbor's bombing on December 7th, 1941. Now, the 1936 Olympics is known as the Hitler Olympics. And I'm not going to go too much into the background of what actually happened at the Olympics, but I want to talk about Roosevelt's role or non-role in leading up to the 1936 Olympics. Now, in late 1935, the former Assistant Secretary for the United States Navy, Ernest Lee Janke, and Jeremiah Mahoney, Judge Jeremiah Mahoney, pushed for an American boycott of the 1936 Berlin Summer Games. Now, when I became interested in this, when I went to the Holocaust Museum in Washington, D.C., and I saw this little plaque of Jeremiah Mahoney. I'm saying, what is Jeremiah Mahoney doing in the Holocaust Museum? I'm going to answer that question. May take a couple minutes, but I'm going to answer that question. You have Janke and you have Mahoney pushing for a boycott of the 1936 Berlin Games. Roosevelt is the president. Janke was an American International Olympic delegate. He was of German descent, and he was outraged about reports he was reading within Hitler's Germany, what he was getting. And on November 25th, 1935, he sends a letter to the International Olympic Committee President, the Count. There's a lot of counts, earls, and lords always in the International Olympic Committee movement. Andre Latour floating an initial idea of an American boycott of the Summer Games, There were two Olympics in Germany in 1936, the Munich area, Bavarian area, Winter Games, and the Summer Games. It was the Summer Games that people were really talking about. Judge Jeremiah Mahoney recommended that America drop out of the Berlin Games. That was in December of 1935. A number of United States Catholic leaders joined Mahoney. The New York Governor Al Smith, Massachusetts Governor James Curley, calling for a boycott. The Berlin or Hitler Games was politically charged, but Franklin Roosevelt urged the American team to go to the Berlin Games, knowing full well about the strangulation of Jewish rights in Germany. I work with Marty Glickman. remember Marty Glickman, if you're a sports fan. Marty Glickman was the voice of the New York Giants. He had a broadcasting school in the 1980s, and I was kind of one of the quote-unquote instructor aides back then. And I asked Marty about FDR, and he said, I didn't want to boycott the Olympics. I was going to go, which he and Sam Stoll are both from New York City, both on the Olympic team. We're supposed to run in the 4x4 relay. And he was going to go because he wanted to go up to the podium, take his gold medal, shove it right into the Führer's face. Well, didn't happen. Marty and Sam were sidelined probably by Avery Brundage, but Roosevelt decided that the American team should go and compete in the Olympics. It gave legitimacy to Adolf Hitler. There's Marty and there is Sam. They never got to participate in any Olympics because there was no Olympics in 1940, no Olympics in 1944. And by the time the Olympics came back, Marty Glickman was 30 years old. Sam was about 33, and they were too old for the 1948 London Games. Pearl Harbor would be attacked on December 7th, 1941, and this leads to something called the Green Light Letter. Kennesaw Mountain Landis was the commissioner of baseball, and after Pearl Harbor is attacked on December 7th, 1941, and America goes to war, both in the European and the Pacific front, Kennesaw Mountain Landis sends a letter to Franklin Roosevelt asking what I should do. Should we have baseball or shouldn't we have baseball? And this is the Green Light Letter, which you can see up in Hyde Park. And Roosevelt said, play ball. There will be fewer people unemployed and everyone will work longer hours and harder than ever before. And that means they ought to have a chance for recreation and for taking their minds off their work even more than before. The Green Light Letter allowed Major League Baseball to play, National League and the American League, allowed the National Football League to go ahead. Most of the teams in the National Football League were based near an Army or Navy center, with the exception of Pittsburgh. And Pittsburgh continued playing, but they amalgamated their team in 1943 with Philadelphia, the Philadelphia Navy Yard, and with the Chicago Cardinals, the Great Lakes Navy Yards. Football went through. I once talked to Dan Rooney, who was the president of the Pittsburgh Steelers, and he said, we never got an official notification from FDR that we could play. We just took it we could play because he told Kennesaw Mountain Landis, go ahead and play. So Franklin Roosevelt thought it was good for the morale of the country to keep baseball and other sports going. Ike, I like Ike. During Dwight Eisenhower's day, there was the Cold War. And Eisenhower was looking for an opening in the Cold War. And I found this out by going to the Rockefeller Center one day. And it was the anniversary, it was the 15th anniversary of the United States Olympic hockey team, 1980 Olympic hockey team, which won the gold medal and beat the Soviets along the way. They didn't beat the Soviets for the gold medal. And the 35th anniversary of the Lake Placid Games, 1960 games, where the United States hockey team won the gold medal, beating Czechoslovakia. And Bill Cleary was there, and he was part of the 1956 team and the 1960 United States Olympic hockey team. And he said to me, do you ever hear our story about going to Moscow? And I said, no, I didn't. And I said, I'd like to know about it. Tell me about it. So Bill Cleary told me about it. Eisenhower tried to put a thaw in the Cold War. I don't know if you could put a thaw. I guess you could put a thaw in something cold. Yeah, why not? With the Soviet Union in the late 1950s, and he sent a United States hockey team, the national hockey team, the Olympic hockey team, along with the track and field team, to play some exhibition games against the Soviets in Moscow. The New York Rangers and Boston Bruins also ended up playing a series of exhibition hockey games. The Soviets took up hockey after 1946, and within 10 years, they were a world-class team. Eisenhower decides, okay, let's do a cultural exchange. we'll send hockey teams over there. We'll send track and field teams over there. They'll send the Bolshoi Ballet over and the Moscow Circus. As a kid, I loved the Moscow Circus watching Ed Sullivan. And I know some of you watched the Ed Sullivan Show. That was part of the Topio Gigio, Dancing Bears of the Circus, aimed at kids like me, 6, 7 years old at the time, 8 years old at the time. So we got the Dancing Bears, which I loved, and they got hockey. But Cleary talks about what it was like being part of this traveling exhibition designed to simmer down the tensions between the United States and the Soviet Union. And there's Bill Cleary. Bill Cleary was one of the captains of the United States hockey team back in the 1950s and 60s. He came from Massachusetts. Cleary tells of eating in a Moscow restaurant with his teammates. The restaurant was part of a hotel with his teammates, and the Soviet intimidation tactic of the day. The team flies out to the Soviet Union. They get to Moscow and they get a nice welcome. They go to the hotel being probably classic neo-Soviet architecture, all gray in those days. And so they get to the restaurant part of the hotel, and this is Cleary talking about the Soviet intimidation tactic of the day. Cleary said, they went to the table, everything is lined up as it would for a fine meal, but there was something in the soup bowl. And the models of a Sputnik aircraft was at every table and every soup bowl to remind the Americans while they were dining that it was the Soviet Union and not the United States that was successful for getting into space. And there was Sputnik. And I've asked people, and if I was live now, I'd ask you the same thing. If you were around in those days, if you were afraid of Sputnik. And there was this guy, I don't remember where he was because I generally do about 200 talks a year. And there was this guy who said, yeah, I was concerned about Sputnik, not because Sputnik was a beach ball sized thing loaded with information that went beep, beep, beep. He said what was launched on was an ICBM, which probably could reach the east coast of the United States. That's what he was concerned about. He wasn't concerned about this little beach ball thing that weighed 180 pounds going into space. But that was Sputnik, and that was the intimidation that the Soviets tried on Americans. Dwight Eisenhower's initiative. By the way, the vice president under Dwight Eisenhower, Richard Nixon. Keep that in mind. There's John F. Kennedy. John F. Kennedy did not have a long presidency. He was assassinated on November 22nd, 1963. But he did two things in sports that changed the National Football League. One, September 30th of 1961, he signs into law the Sports Broadcast Act of 1961, which changes the financing of football and allows football to become, by 1965, the #1 spectator sport, according to the Harris poll, in the United States. It's the Sports Broadcast Act of 1961, and most of the legwork was done by a Brooklyn congressman by the name of Emanuel Cellar, who I do believe entered Congress around the War of 1812. Emanuel Cellar gets no credit for this, but he's the guy who wrote the bill in the House that eventually Kennedy would sign, that basically allowed the National Football League to skirt antitrust law and allowed the National Football League to take 14 of its teams, all 14 of its teams in 1961, packaging them as one to sell to a television network, bidding in those days between CBS and NBC. And when I do my early days of TV talk, I talk about how William Paley, the head of CBS, and David Sarnoff of NBC hated one another because in 1948, Jack Benny, Burns and Allen, and a whole bunch of other people left NBC for CBS, and NBC decided to fund the Football League, the American Football League, in 1964. It's a different talk. Kennedy not responsible for the actual legislation. That was Cellar. And what Cellar did was allow the league to package its broadcast rights. Major League Baseball did that. They had a Supreme Court ruling in the 1920s, 1922, that allowed them antitrust exemption. So they were able to package their 16 teams as one to sell to TV networks, which is what the National Football League did. And that's what the American Football League did in 1959. But they flew under the radar as a new league, so nobody really cared about that. Cellar did allow the National Football League to sell its teams as one, evenly spreading out the broadcast revenues among the franchises. Green Bay was good. They had enough money to pay their players because they had the same amount of money as the New York Giants, the richest team in the National Football League in 1961. And there were big regional networks. Washington had one, the Giants had one, Chicago had one, Los Angeles had one, Green Bay didn't. And all of a sudden, everything was equaled out. And on any given Sunday, which was the slogan of the National Football League, any team could win. There is Emmanuel Cellar, who should be in the National Football League Hall of Fame and in all sports Hall of Fames because he evened out the money. And he changed sports because the act would apply to the National Basketball Association, even though they had a network contract with ABC, but ABC or NBC, ABC wasn't a full network back in those days. The National Hockey League and other sports, Major League Baseball had the exemption, so they weren't included in this bill. The other thing he did, JFK and the NFL Washington team. That is George Preston Marshall. Hey, he was a proud racist. He told you he was a racist. There was no ifs, ands, and buts. He was a racist. Never hired a Negro player for his National Football League team. Whether it was in Boston or in Washington, he moved his team from Washington to Boston, rather from Boston to Washington in the 1930s. The National Football League had a color barrier up from, say, 1933 through 1945, and basically it is said that it was George Preston Marshall who impressed upon the other National Football League owners not to hire any colored players or Negro players during that time. That was overturned in 1946 by the Los Angeles Coliseum Commission when Daniel Reeves decided to move his Cleveland Rams football team to Los Angeles. And one of the provisions in the lease was we're an equal opportunity employee. We took government money to build this place. You have to hire Negro players, which he did. He hired two, Kenny Washington and Woody Strode. You probably know Woody Strode better as an actor. He was in things like Spartacus over the years. George Preston Marshall used to get into philosophical conversations with people like Shirley Povich, who was the sports editor of the Washington Post. Shirley Povich from Maine. A little story about Shirley Povich. You may know his son, Maury Povich, and his show, Who's Your Daddy, basically. Maury Povich show where they test the paternity of some kid. And Maury lived to about 100 years. Rather, Shirley lived to about 100 years old, and that's about 20 years ago. And he said, he was asked, he said, "Are you proud of what Maury does?" He said, "I wasn't until I saw his paycheck, and then I said, how do I get one of those shows?" Anyway, Maury Povich used to write columns in the Washington Post asking, when, Mr. Marshall, are you going to desegregate your team? One of the answers that came back, I'll desegregate my team when the Harlem Globetrotters hire a white guy. But George Preston Marshall ran up against something that he couldn't beat. He would hire a Negro player in 1962. He was the last holdout in the National Football League. In fact, the Boston Bruins in the National Hockey League had a Negro player in the National Hockey League, which was all white for a long, long time in 1959 before George Preston Marshall. But he had to give in because the Kennedy administration played hardball with him. Marshall wanted to move into a new stadium. He wanted to leave Griffith Stadium, which incidentally today, the land underneath Griffith Stadium is owned by Howard University, a traditional black college. Anyway, he gives into a threat by the Kennedy administration, which would not have allowed Marshall to move into the new federally funded DC stadium. And if you know anything about what goes on in Washington, if you're building something big, the feds are always involved in it. Udell, the Secretary of the Interior, said, you want to come in here? We have equal opportunity work requirements. The federal government decided to build a multi-purpose stadium in Washington for the Washington Senators baseball team and Marshall's football team. And there is Stuart Udell. Stuart Udell forced the hand. He was the Secretary of the Interior, and he pushed Marshall and made him obey the legislation that prohibited discrimination in federal facilities. DC Stadium, a federal facility. Udell gives Marshall an ultimatum: hire a Negro player or find somewhere else to play, like Griffith Stadium or somewhere else in Washington. Ultimately, he being Marshall, Ernie Davis, the running back from Syracuse University. And he would trade Ernie Davis to the Cleveland Browns for Bobby Mitchell, who just recently passed away, who I knew. Bobby Mitchell, every big affair in Washington wasn't an affair unless Bobby Mitchell was there for years and years and years. He spent his career in Washington from 1962. He continued with the football team until the 21st century. I told Bobby one day, the best thing that ever happened to you was Stuart Udell, and he said, I cannot disagree with you. Bobby wanted to be a dentist, but he ended up playing football. Ernie Davis got traded to Cleveland. Unfortunately, he contracted leukemia and he died never playing a game with Cleveland. He was sent, Bobby Mitchell was sent with a first-round draft pick to Washington for Ernie Davis, and Marshall got his 30-year lease. The Boston Celtics ended up in the White House in 1963 visiting John F. Kennedy. Who is not there is Bill Russell for whatever reason, but you can see some of the players there. Seth Sanders is there. Arnold, Red Auerbach is there. Bob Cousy, John Havlicek, Tommy Heinz, and a whole bunch of other, Buddy LaRue, the trainer, all meeting with Kennedy, who came from Boston. It was the Boston Celtics basketball team in the 1960s that staged the first sports protest in Kentucky because players were not served at a restaurant. That's another talk I do. Lyndon Johnson created the modern National Football League. Lyndon Johnson's signature is on the bill, 1966, November 8th, 1966, that would ultimately create the Super Bowl. Much of the legwork would come from Emmanuel Cellar from Brooklyn and two Louisiana politicians, Russell Long, Hal Boggs. Super Bowl created in part by Johnson's 1964 Civil Rights Act. The roots can be traced back to a game that was never played. That's the Super Bowl roots, the 1964-65 National American Football League All-Star Game. 22 African-American players boycotted that game. It set off a series of events that concluded with the first ever American Football League National Football League Championship game about 2 years afterwards. Despite the passage of the Civil Rights Act in 1964, African-American players who were selected to play in New Orleans encountered all sorts of problems, denied cab rides into New Orleans, called names, even threatened with physical violence going into a club on Bourbon Street. Somebody, Ernie Ladd, San Diego Chargers player, was threatened with a bouncer who had a gun, threatened to kill him if he walked into the place. Cookie Gilchrist led the boycott. The aftermath, New Orleans never got an AFL team. They were supposed to get one for 1965. Two leagues merged in 1966, but it needed congressional approval. New Orleans became a political football. Louisiana Senator Russell Long, the fifth most powerful Democrat in the Democratic-controlled Senate in those days, and Hal Boggs, father of Cokie Roberts, congressman, key players who threatened to undo the boycott unless New Orleans got a team. They did get a team. There is me standing behind Pete Rozelle, who was sent down to Washington to convince Long and Boggs that this merger was necessary. That was 1986. That's the steps of the courthouse, Southern District of New York, down at Foley Square during the United States Football League, National Football League antitrust trial. That was Fortune magazine. Rozelle could not get things done the way he wanted to, and eventually would trade franchise in New Orleans in exchange for the merger. And Lyndon Johnson would get the merger done. But there were some things that Emmanuel Cellar wanted in there, including the New York Jets not moving to Los Angeles Rams to San Diego Chargers to New Orleans, and Oakland to either Portland or Seattle. And Cellar said the 24 teams that were there right at that point had to stay in their cities, which means Joe Namath and the New York Jets had to stay at Shea Stadium through 1970, and were not going to be moved. The team was not going to be moved to Los Angeles. The first AFL-NFL championship game was in Los Angeles. 1/3 of the place was empty, as you can see in this picture. Kansas City Chiefs, Green Bay Packers. Green Bay wins the game 35-10. And that was the last time a Super Bowl, not known as Super Bowl at that point, an AFL-NFL World Championships game was not sold out. That was played on January 15th, 1967. Oh, there he is. I actually knew him. I dealt with him 1985, 1986, 1987. He was brought back into the public consciousness through baseball. There was a dispute between Major League umpires and Major League Baseball. Contract dispute, collective bargaining. And they were going nowhere. And Richie Phillips, who was the head of the Umpires Association, Umpires Union, lived in Philadelphia, lived in Society Hill off the main line. And his next door neighbors, Julie and David Eisenhower. And on the weekend, I would come to babysit. He would go babysit on the weekends. And Richie got to know him through David and suggested to Peter Ueberroth, the Major League Baseball commissioner, why don't we go to arbitration? Sure, why not? Who you got by? Dick Nixon. Dick Nixon? Dick Nixon? Yeah, Dick Nixon. And Dick Nixon settled the baseball dispute and would re-enter proper society, not through the Frost interviews, but through baseball. And I was there. And if I was live with you instead of recording, I'd tell you the whole background of the story about going down to Foley Square, sitting in his office. Why not? Me, Arthur Shack, and Gene Orza. Orza calls me from the Players Association, Baseball Players Association. What are you doing this afternoon? Nothing. He said, want to go see Dick Nixon? What? He said, Dick Nixon? Yeah, sure. Where? He said, at his office at Foley Square. And we go down there, and his secretary said, Mr. Nixon isn't there. He'll be in a little while, but you're welcome to sit in his office. And his office was a replica of the Oval Office. And we all jumped in the chair and go, and if we had this device back in the day, this device, the cell phone, if we had that device back in the day, I'd have 1,000 selfies of me going, oh my God. Anyway, and Gene would too, and the late Arthur Shack would have as well. Ping pong diplomacy, 1971. Richard Nixon goes to China in 1972. But in 1971, the United States table tennis team traveled to then Red China, or Communist China, to challenge. They didn't go to China. They went actually to the Yoga Japan to play in a table tennis championship. But they would travel to Red or Communist China in 1971 after playing a Chinese team in Japan. Ping pong diplomacy. And it produces a thaw in the United States-Red China relationship. And this happens in 1971 when a 19-year-old player from the United States, Glenn Cowan, hopped on the shuttle bus carrying the red-shirted Chinese national team. Chuan Zhang stepped forward, shook Cowan's hand, spoke to him through an interpreter. They would eventually exchange gifts. Mao Zedong, who's looking for an opening. He's looking for the United States to become friends with after he has a fallout with the Soviet Union, which included the Soviets almost nuking China in 1969. They exchanged gifts. Mao was pleased as punch by this. Cowan, who was a self-described hippie, there were no hippies in 1971, that died out in 1967, another talk, gives his Chinese counterpart a t-shirt with the Beatles lyric, Let It Be. Mao shocks the world by inviting the team to an all-expense-paid visit to China. After checking with the embassy, the American players accepted. I was surprised as I was pleased. I never expected that the Chinese initiative would come to fruition in the form of a ping pong team. And that leads to Nixon going to China in 1972. On April 14th, the same day that the players met with Zhou Enlai, Nixon announces, and Zhou Enlai was Prime Minister of China at that point, that travel bans and embargoes against China are gone for the first time since 1949. The Americans and the Chinese governments would soon open up new back-channel communications with one another. During Nixon's time, Title IX is passed, 1972. That's where women got equal access to education with men at all colleges and universities in the United States. That accepted federal funding. That's Edith Green. She was a congresswoman from Oregon starting in 1955, winning an election 1954. Nixon signs the Title IX legislation that was designed to give women an equal opportunity to get an education in American colleges and universities with men, and also on the sports side, create opportunities for women to be equal to men in getting funding for sports. No person in the United States shall, on the basis of sex, be excluded from participation in, be denied the benefits of, or subjected to discrimination under any education program or activity receiving federal finance assistance. The battle of Title IX continues. Women's sports still being fought. Even the United States women's soccer team now appealing a court decision of a couple of days ago, with some coaches, athletic directors, crying foul, saying they have to cut men's sports programs and keep women's programs to stay in compliance with Title IX rules. Munich 11. Also in 1972, the 1972 Munich Olympics, and I'm not going to get much in the background of that other than Black September, got into the Munich Olympic Village, kidnapped, and 9 Israeli athletes and 2 coaches. Eventually, they think they're freed. They all died in a botched rescue attempt by the Germans. There is the massacre, the first time that you ever saw terrorism in your living room, playing out live on ABC TV. Jim McKay. I want to give a shout out to Jim McKay, Jim McManus, who is absolutely magnificent during the 14 hours that he was on, describing what was going on. Howard Cosell was there. Howard told me I was there. Knew Howard. I know his grandsons, Justin and Colin, and we're friends. We're friends. Howard's been gone over 20 years, and I'm still friends with Colin and Justin. And Colin is the PA announcer for the New York Mets these days. Nixon has a role in this, or tries to have a role in this as well. He sends a telegram to Avery Brundage, who is the head of the International Olympic Committee, demands that the rest of the games be called off. There is Brundage, who in 1971 told interviewers in Germany that the finest games ever held in the Olympics were the 1939 Berlin Games. His construction company built some buildings in Washington, D.C. for the Nazi regime in 1937, diplomatic buildings. Still had diplomatic ties with Germany back in 1937. The games must go on, and they did. And Brundage, with 27 words, I'm sorry, games must go on. Nixon also wants to watch football. Let's watch football. Why not? Hey, he is the most powerful person in the world. He's in the Oval Office. He wants to watch football. I'll do this Jack Webb style, just the facts. 1950, the NFL commissioner Burt Bell told his owners to black out home games, so people would go to stadiums instead of staying home watching games in front of their TV. That was upheld, and it was legal. Bell's plea to owners came after Los Angeles Rams ownership saw a 50% drop in attendance in 1949 compared to 1948 home games after the team signed a deal with the Admiral Television Company to do games in Southern California. People stayed home, presumably watched on the Admiral TV. Admiral was the sponsor of Los Angeles games. By 1951, rather, the NFL was in the courtroom defending its blackout policy. 1953, the judge Alan K. Grimm upheld the league's blackout policy, believing it was not in violation of antitrust laws. Grimm told the NFL if they went along and tried to sell their teams as one, they would be in violation of antitrust laws, which is why they got before Congress in 1961. The blackout problem resurfaced in 57. Detroit did not see the game. They hosted the game. The game was a sellout, but nothing happened. So I have nothing to do on Sunday. I'm just the president of the United States. There's nothing to do. I have nothing to do. His friend George Allen there, who is to Nixon's left, Marv Levy, the only Harvard-educated coach, is at the end of that row in National Football League history. Over officiate jerks. I used to love talking to Marv. I needed the source to do it, but I love talking to him. Anyway, he wants to see his friend George Allen's football team, the Washington team. So, Dateline, Washington, on December 18th, 1972, 2:06 in the afternoon, Nixon meets with Attorney General Richard Kleindienst at the executive office. Just the facts, man, just the facts. The reason? He wanted to watch his friend George Allen's Washington NFL playoff game, but couldn't. He's the most important guy in the world, and he can't watch a football game. Oh, I want to watch it. I can't watch it. It's blacked out in Washington. Probably at Camp David as well. I think it was satellites. He wanted to intervene because Green Bay was playing Washington. It was sold out. It's blacked out in Washington. That gets Congress moving. A compromise was eventually reached, allowing blackouts. Any game was not sold within 72 hours of kickoff. Nixon would sign the bill. In 1973, the league adopted a 72-hour rule after the law expired in 1975, and that goes on until this day. Jimmy Carter had an Afghanistan problem. I do a 1980 talk. Now, in 1980, I was involved with a lot of this. I was 23, 24 years old. I was working at WGRC. I was working with WNEW. I got to interview Reagan. I got to interview Kennedy. I got to do all the New York Senate candidates, with the exception of Bess Meyerson in the 1980 race. I covered the Democratic National Convention. I got to deal with the United States hockey team that beat the Russians or the Soviets, and culminating in me being at Stewart Air Force Base in January of 1981, covering the returning hostages from Iran. Bob Mamulak and I, WRKL, hi Bob, it's in his book, Newsroom Confessions. And he talks about me and him being up at Stewart Air Force Base, never getting a chance to interview the hostages, returning hostages, as they were on the bus, and we got to wave to them. Anyway, Jimmy Carter, 1980. Jimmy Carter gives the Soviets an ultimatum. This is in January 1980. Pull your troops out of Afghanistan by February 20th, 1980, or the United States would boycott the U.S. Summer Games or the Olympic Summer Games in Moscow. On March 21st, the United States pulled out of the Moscow Games. They were joined by, or the United States was joined by 60 other countries in the boycott. The USA chant starts in Lake Placid in February of 1980. The United States Olympic hockey team defeats the Soviets. This is not the medal game. This is the game prelude to the medal game, which would be between the United States and Finland. Carter issues a trade embargo on two goods that the Soviets would desperately need: grain and informational technology for computers. He also restricted Soviet fishing in American-controlled ocean waters. The Soviets would pull out of Afghanistan in 1989. The boycott failed. And there is Ronald Reagan. Ronald Reagan gave a couple gifts to the sports industry. One, the 1984 Cable TV Act. The other was in 1986 when the tax laws were rewritten. 1984, Reagan signs into law the Cable TV Act of 1984. It socializes cable TV for the most part. For those who wanted almost everything offered on the basic expanded tier. You had to take everything or nothing. And sports owners glommed on to that basic tier. It saves ESPN, CNN, Weather Channel, and others. And you had to pay for all of that, whether you wanted it or not. And cable TV, those networks started to make money because fees went to them. And in the sports case, it is now the highest paid, or the highest paid channels on cable, satellite, or phone are the sports channels, and that goes back to 1984. The sports owners found a gold mine, and because you have to take everything, if you want the basic expanded, you take that and take the expense. ESPN's about $7 a month. Here locally, the Yes Network is what, about $5-6 a month. Sports New York, SNY, also the same. MSG is also the same. Very, very expensive. The most expensive part of your cable TV is the sports package. The impact, consumers, it's like the Frank Sinatra song, all or nothing at all. Everything offered on the basic expanded tier or nothing at all. Legislation saved ESPN, CNN, and others from financial ruin. Sports operators made money, major money, hundreds of millions of dollars, billions of dollars from cable TV. That is Cincinnati, and that's a new baseball park in Cincinnati. Not so new anymore. It's 2 decades old. And it was built as part of the 1986 tax code reform. Reagan left an enormous impact on sports, putting his signature on the Tax Reform Act of 1986, a bipartisan legislation. Dick Gephardt, a Democrat in the House, helped work on that. The Tax Reform Act of 1986 opened a loophole of tax laws, gave owners ammunition in battles with cities and states to get stadiums. The law gave municipalities a federal tax exemption on bonds to build new stadiums. After the 1986 tax code revision was passed, sports owners figured out that under the right circumstances, an owner could keep up to 92 cents out of every dollar generated in a publicly funded stadium or an arena, leaving 8 cents to go down to pay the debt. In Cincinnati, they had to sell off a municipal hospital, raise taxes, lay off workers for the debt on that stadium. They built 2 stadiums, a football stadium and a baseball stadium in Cincinnati. And basically, to fund the stadium, they had to do all sorts of things. Raising taxes, laying off people. I spoke at the George Bush Presidential Library in 2007. Unfortunately, when I was there, they were doing renovations at the place, so I only got to see half of the museum. That was a State Department job. Gates, who was the head of Texas A&M, who would become the Secretary of Defense, signed off on it along with Condoleezza Rice. I'm not going to tell you who I voted for, but I had a good joke that almost, when I got there, that almost floored the curator, who didn't find it so funny, but the students thought it was great. It was 4 Americans, 1 Canadian, 3 Russians, 3 Indonesians, 3 Nigerians, 3 Turks, 3 Venezuelans, and I had to talk to them about the politics of sports business, 2007. I'm still in contact with one of the Nigerians, and this is now almost 13 years ago, August of 2007. George Bush signed into law the Anabolic Steroids Control Act of 1990. That legislation made the possession of steroids illegal without a physician's consent. And of course, the steroids era in baseball is largely thought to be the 1990s. And I'm not going to go too much into that. There have been a lot of fingers pointed at a lot of players who allegedly took steroids. However, they're allegations. Nothing was ever proven. But in the 1990s, if anybody did take steroids, they were conceivably breaking the law. And there were a couple people who did go to jail, Olympians, but not on the steroids bust, but on lying about the steroids. That was done by Bush. Clinton tried to solve the 1994-95 baseball strike struck out doing it. He called the warring sides together, Major League Players Association, the owners, into the Oval Office, tried to hammer out a settlement, failed miserably. Those guys did go to court, National Labor Relations Act, and Sotomayor, who is now a Supreme Court Justice, ruled against the owners in April of '95. I should put the picture up with me. Next time I do this, I got me and Don Fear on a rainy day in April of 1995 down there, and basically said, play ball. And they did. Kirk Flood Act 1998, signed into law by Clinton, gave baseball players the same rights under American antitrust laws that baseball, football, hockey, and soccer players had. George W. Bush, 2004, 2005, State of the Union address in 2004, a segment on steroids and athletes using steroids and how that was wrong. 2005, Congress held hearings on the use of steroids in sports. Also, 2004, the Bush administration provided a good deal of security for the Athens Olympics. Hundreds of millions of dollars worth of security as part of the war on terrorism. Barack Obama, a couple things about Obama. He failed to get the Olympics for Chicago in 2016. He talked about it going out to Copenhagen. They weren't going to get it anyway. It was going to go to Brazil because of the BRIC countries at that point, Brazil, Russia, India, China, emerging economies. The Olympics never took place in South America, but Obama thought Chicago had a good shot at getting it. I remember this vividly when Chicago had a bid for the 2016 Olympics. Very effective committee had flown to Copenhagen to make their presentation, and Michelle, Mrs. Obama, had gone with them. I got a call, I think, before the thing had ended, but on fairly short notice, that everyone thought if I flew out there, we had a good chance of getting in, and it might be worth essentially just taking a one-day trip. So we fly out there. Subsequently, I think we've learned that IOC decisions are similar to FIFA, the governing body of soccer decisions, a little bit cooked. Both FIFA and the IOC are facing all kind of legal trouble around the world to this day. We didn't make the first cut, despite the fact by all objective metrics, the American bid was the best. Barack Obama had no idea that Teddy Roosevelt had saved football. That was 109 years earlier. And he had the concussion summit. The concussion summit was rather simple. Bring people in, talk about brain injuries in sports, cheerleading, football. Obama said if he had boys, he would not have allowed them to play football because of the concussion issue. They had the summit. Nothing happened. NFL, college football, high school football playing lip service to concussions. And it was a big deal a few years ago, but nothing has really happened. Players go into concussion protocol. There are still deaths on the high school football field. Donald Trump has a couple things that he did in sports. Pledged support for the 2028 Los Angeles Olympics, which is still ongoing. We may not see a Tokyo Olympics in 2020 or even 2021. We still have the Los Angeles Olympics on the books. Hopefully, I'm here because I can't be with you because of the coronavirus, COVID-19. Hopefully, that'll be eradicated by 2028. He also pledged support for the 2026 World Cup, which will be hosted by the United States, Canada, and New Mexico. Again, if we get a favorable outcome to this COVID virus situation, which we're in right now. He also pardoned Jack Johnson. Jack Johnson arrested with the Mann Act, transporting women over state lines for immoral purposes, went to jail, never got a pardon. Jack Johnson did that in the 19-teens. He was the heavyweight champion of the world, and he was Negro, colored, and he married white women, and people in those days didn't like it. John McCain, for years and years and years, tried to get Jack Johnson pardoned. Donald Trump finally pardoned him. A couple other people, the Mann Act, Chuck Berry, who went to jail, Charlie Chaplin. Right now, we're trying to figure out how to get sports back on the field. Thank you so much for listening to me. I appreciate it. Hopefully the next time I'm in Livingston at the library, I'll be able to say hello to you. I enjoyed being here, and hopefully we could do this again. Thank you to everybody at the library. I appreciate it. And thank you to my friends who have come to see me in other things at Livingston, and hopefully we'll see you soon live. Bye-bye. I'm Evan Weiner.